Hello and welcome to the I Just Did It for a Project podcast, the podcast that I just did for a project. Before we start, I want to make sure that you can hear this podcast in the highest quality possible, which is why I'm happy to announce the sponsor of this video, Raycons. Raycon makes high-quality wireless earbuds that have a battery life uncompared to by competing brands and an extremely comfortable feel that will make your purchase worth every penny. Anyways, back to the video. During the Second World War, America was able to conquer a very large amount of the planet, just like I can conquer your characters and dungeons in Raid Shadow Legends, the sponsors of today's video. Make sure to use the description for a 10% off your first heroes in Raid Shadow Legends. Being able to conquer so many places means that many Americans were traveling the world as soldiers and seeing many new places, ideas, and cultures. This resulted in many American soldiers going through culture shock, not only during deployment, but also when returning to America because of differences caused by the cultural and economical impact of a war, especially on the scale of World War II. During this time, international communication within civilians was vastly less expansive than it is today. Without internet, people were not able to communicate quickly, and other than letters sent home, which was quite a hassle and took lots of time, there wasn't really a good way to talk with people back at home. Therefore, culture spread very slowly and inconsistently anywhere abroad and could be somewhat mysterious. Although international travel was a thing before World War II, many people, especially those who were younger or could not yet afford the luxury of traveling across the pond, first experienced international travel via deployment in the war. Luckily for us, we have the internet today, but it's important to make sure that you avoid hackers who want to steal your encrypted data. Fortunately, we have NordVPN. Make sure to use the link in the description to start your 30-day free trial of Nord using the code Jimmy should get an A on this sign up. Anyways, back to the video. The lack of a global network led to not only more frequent communication between those deployed and the people in their environments, but it also led to a lot of miscommunications or straight up lies between governments and civilians that couldn't happen today. Many civilians and soldiers actually opposed the war and fighting and were able to get along with those who were on opposite sides of them. A good example is the Japanese civilians who were actually very welcoming to the American troops when they arrived in Japan. However, this can go both ways. For example, Japanese troops would fight to the death, which is something Americans were not really expecting when they first started invading Japan. This actually caused trouble, for example, if Americans were trying to capture Japanese soldiers, and it actually had a somewhat significant impact on the war overall. In terms of governments communicating with their people, there was a lot of things that could have been made up for propaganda. In an interview with J.S. Adams, a veteran from the 37th Engineers Battalion, he talks about a German asking him if they had actually bombed New York, something that was mentioned in German propaganda at the time. This of course did not actually happen and was just used to boost morale of German soldiers in the war. But once again, German citizens didn't have a way to actually verify if this was true or not. This just goes to show how hard it was at the time to get information about different societies and culture. One of the most major shocks for American soldiers was obviously the situation in Germany with the Holocaust and finding the concentration camps. I'd say that this is actually one of the best examples of culture shock during the war, as some of the American soldiers that found concentration camps were so appalled that they actually weren't even able to wrap their head around what they were seeing. One of the first times that Americans actually heard about the concentration camps was when the 42nd Battalion invaded Dachau. Upon liberating it, American soldiers got the testimonies of people there and sent them back to America. Of course, culture shock didn't just happen overseas. It also happened to American soldiers who had been on deployment when they returned back to a completely different America from which they had left. By far, one of the biggest changes in America during the war was women joining the workforce. Are you a woman during or immediately after the Second World War? Well, even if you aren't, there may be jobs that you want to have, but you just don't have the skills for it. That's why I want to introduce you to today's sponsor, Squarespace, a website for learning skills like how to build an automobile or write a podcast in 30 minutes. I personally can vouch for these classes and I would highly recommend them. Remember to use the link in the description to get 30% off your first class. Back to the video. With both a husband and a wife working in the average American household, many people found themselves with a lot of new money that they didn't originally have. With newfound capital in their households, Americans were able to buy many luxury goods, and with newfound capital in the economy, America was able to support manufacturing luxury goods, which is a practice that is pretty much held up to the current date. It's safe to say that during the war, many Americans went through culture shock. America, being such an isolated country sitting between two very large oceans, did not have a lot of cultural exchange, especially between common folk. At the time, the world was basically split over different beliefs and ways of life, and although many places post-war became westernized during the war, there was still a lot for the US to learn about other countries and vice versa. Did you enjoy the podcast? You can listen to other podcasts and many books with Audible. Recently, I've been working hard on starting a podcast, which cuts into my valuable reading time. Luckily, I can work while listening to books on Audible. Use the link in my description to get a free 30-day trial with Audible.